Hello there and welcome to the Digital Foundry Switch 2 hardware review. We've had the system now for getting on for a couple of weeks. We have a lot of conclusions about its capabilities, things we love, things we like, things we don't really like. and similar to our PlayStation 5 Pro review, it's going to be a triple header. Joining me first of all, Oliver Mackenzie. Hello.
Yes, Rich, should be a fun one today and hopefully a comprehensive one too. Excited to get into it with the two of you.
Absolutely. And of course, John Linneman. Hello.
Yes, indeed. It's good to be here, guys. I think there's a lot to talk about regarding the Switch 2, so let's get into it.
Absolutely. Yes, obviously we're going to be talking about the hardware and the screen specifically. That's a huge topic for debate there. We're going to be talking about things that genuinely surprised us. Power consumption, battery life. These things have actually come in better than expected. Very impressive stuff overall. We're also going to be talking about VRR, one of the key features of the Switch 2, and trying to figure out whether it's any good or not. Does it work? Beyond that, we'll be talking about cartridges, internal storage, MicroSD Express, some loading times tests there. Wi-Fi, my God, the amount of aggravation I've had with the Switch 1 Wi-Fi system over the years. Has it been fixed for Switch 2? We shall discover. More backwards compatibility testing. We've got some pretty definitive testing on the limits of it, because so far, based on pretty much all the tests I've seen, seems to be a case of almost limitless extra power being given to those Switch 1 games. It's not quite that, but it is still impressive nonetheless. GameChat, of course, we've tested it. That was quite interesting as well. And beyond that, overall thoughts and gripes and suggestions for improvement. But where do we begin? I guess we want to talk about the hardware, right, Oliver? What do we want to discuss first?
Yeah, well, in terms of the overall hardware overview, I mean, the Switch 2, obviously, it's a very similar device to the original Switch. I've got it right here. It has a much larger screen. That's a key hardware feature. It's also a much larger device physically in the hand. And I feel like people have discussed it quite a bit. Obviously, you have the magnetic attachments for the Joy-Cons. That's quite an exciting feature. And then internally, obviously, you have the Tegra T239 processor, which we've discussed in some depth here. It has a 998 megahertz clock. In docked mode, it has a 1.1 gigahertz clock. In portable mode, it has 8 ARM Cortex-A78C cores. It has 1536 CUDA cores of the Ampere architecture. On the GPU side of things, it has a 1.007 megahertz docked GPU clock, a 561 megahertz portable clock. It has a 128-bit memory interface with up to 6,400 megatransfers per second, I believe, of memory speed there. And it has infamously an 8/10 nanometer SoC with kind of a hybrid process based off of the Samsung processes there. So overall, it's an interesting system. It's certainly an evolution, I would say, of the original Switch design. It's definitely focused, I think, more on the hardware power of the design rather than any kind of unique feature that differentiates it above and beyond the Switch 1. But yeah, overall, I think people who come from the Switch 1, who are familiar with the Switch 1, in the overall hardware sense, they can probably expect a device that is a very iterative jump over the Switch 1, in line with other console refreshes we've seen, in line with like the PlayStation 5, the Series X, other similar console refreshes. It's primarily focused on that power differential.
Right, so a continuity console, if you like, a modern-day version of exactly what we received in 2017, but with a few extra features here and there. John, what's your overall thought of the hardware?
I mean, yeah, we know a lot about this thing already, but my impression is that it is actually very well built in terms of just the materials used, the feel of them. It does feel more in line with the Switch OLED than the original Switch. I like what they use for that. I will say, though, that I still have a couple little issues with certain things. Like, I love the magnetic lock system, but it doesn't hold as tightly as I had hoped. Like, it's better than the rail system, but there's still a little bit of play in it that I don't love. So that is something that I think they'll probably never truly be able to solve, given the nature of it. There's also the screen material, where they seem to actually use a proper, like, glass on screen thing, but it has that sort of like non-removable plastic coating as well, which I suppose is potentially to prevent glass from shattering if it were to break, and Nintendo cautions you not to remove it. But as I have learned from talking to others, that actual coating can scratch very easily, more so than expected. In fact, a friend of mine actually got the Switch 2 out of the box, mistakenly knocked it over, and instantly had a huge gash in the screen that required sending it back right away, which is not cool. Um, so there is some concerns about that. But aside from that, and maybe some concerns over the longevity of the analog sticks, the actual user experience, the feel of the hardware in your hands, it is good. It's an evolution of the Switch. I actually prefer the slightly larger size, especially when holding the Joy-Con separately, whether dual Joy-Con or the or horizontal mode. I'm also a fan of the mouse support. I haven't used it extensively, but where I have used it, it does feel surprisingly natural and comfortable to use. I'm even able to use it on the arm of my large chair there in the background. So for games where I'm playing on the TV, it's not a big ask to actually just use the mouse cursor. So I went through the whole welcome tour using it that way, and it works great. And then lastly, there's the Pro Controller, which I think is really interesting because it has an analog stick that really feels unlike any other analog stick I think I've ever used. Like there's a smooth glide-like motion to it that's quite good. It also is the first controller that has those rear buttons under the grip that I don't find annoying because they're very flush with the plastic, and they're there if you need them, but they don't actually like protrude in a way that's bothersome. Like I really don't like using the Sony or Microsoft solutions. It's just a personal preference thing because you can really feel where those paddles are meant to be, and I don't like that so much. But the controller itself, the materials, the button quality, everything about it is exceptionally good. So I think I also have to say I like the new power supply. And I think it's actually important to note because the original Switch has a very large power supply and the cable is affixed to it. This time they went with a more common, I guess, solution that we're seeing with phones and other portable devices where the power supply is an individual brick with a USB-C port on it. And not only does that allow you to use whatever cable you want, but it also means that you can extend it. So I set up a second dock here on a different display next to me, and I needed to run the power cord longer than the default cable. And I was able to essentially double the length of that cable, provided you get the correct type of USB-C cable that can pass the power without issues. It works great. It powers the dock no problem. And that's excellent because you really couldn't easily do that with the Switch without relying on... There's something about that power supply that was a little bit finicky. So that doesn't seem to be the case here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my take on it is the Pro Controller really is something special. I think it's exceptionally good job by Nintendo there. I'm not really one for wanting to buy peripherals. I think that you should get really good stuff out of the box. But I can understand, with the Joy-Con setup, why a traditional controller is actually quite desirable. And what Nintendo has delivered here in terms of feel of materials, the feedback from the buttons, it's just superb from start to finish. Incredibly good battery life as well, which I think is worth mentioning. Going back to some of the comments you made there, John, I actually think that the concept of having detachable USB-C cables for the peripherals, the camera does that as well, is actually a really good thing specifically, and this is a bit of a gripe, I'm afraid. Some of the cables that are supplied are just too short.
Yeah, they are quite short.
They're very, very short. Specifically, the camera one I find incredibly annoying, so at least you can replace them. Any sort of thoughts on the hardware itself, Oliver, before we move on?
Well, just to touch on that Pro Controller briefly, I think one thing they really do here that's quite cool is if you look at the sticks, they actually don't touch the edge, the rim there, when you push them. They actually have a stick restrictor underneath that cap. So it's actually giving you that smooth gliding feel in the Pro Controller. It's not actually rubbing against the edge, which is unlike the prior Nintendo Switch Pro Controller, unlike the prior Joy-Cons, unlike every other major platform holder's default controller, right? This has been a feature that's only been contained in some high-end third-party controllers until now. So that's a very cool feature. That makes the sticks feel like they have this perfect gliding motion that I've never, ever felt before in a controller, and it feels awesome, I gotta say. And yeah, I don't particularly love back paddles usually, but these just blend in perfectly, and you really don't feel or notice them, especially if you aren't using them, right? So that's another big bonus here. And the materials, the soft touch plastics, that kind of matte appearance, I think it's a perfect controller. My only objection is I really wish it had analog triggers still for my racing games, but I kind of take it like on Nintendo platforms, they're really emphasizing that really fast, narrow trigger feel. They're not really going to give you that analog trigger movement. You're gonna have to play those games in another platform or play them with some accommodation on the Switch, right? So that's just a terrific controller. I also love the Joy-Cons. The new Joy-Cons I think are terrific. I think Nintendo's knocked it out of the park with their controller options this generation.
Okay, well, let's move on to, another part of the hardware setup, which we've got to discuss. It's been pretty much the most controversial element within Digital Foundry. And I think we're kind of accepting now. We've gone through denial, we're now in acceptance that the screen just isn't particularly good overall. And when you're dealing with a handheld, I mean, that's fundamentally one of the key parts you've got to get right. Going into this, I mean, there are certain things that obviously it does right. Well, I'd say it does right. There are feature points that we want: VRR, 120 hertz, HDR. But on pretty much all of those points, I think there have been issues that are compromising to the experience. John, you're particularly upset by this.
Well, disappointed is more like it. So there's fundamentally several key issues with this. And there's been a lot of discussion around this as well. So I want to share my thoughts on each of these. The big one, I think, is response time. Essentially, when dealing with LCDs, there's two things that you have to look out for with blur on a flat panel display. There's persistence blur caused by the sample and hold nature of the panel, which is that it's not like clearing the screen after each line. It's like drawing the frame is drawn, that frame is held until the next frame is drawn. And due to the way our eyes work, that actually causes sort of a blur in motion. All flat panels basically suffer from this by default, OLED included. But LCDs also have to worry about the response time of the pixels and like gray to gray, black on white, different, the transition speed from which one pixel that is on screen is able to disappear from the screen. Slower response time means that you sort of get these like ghost images, pixels left behind, which creates the sensation of blur. Anybody that picked up an original PSP 1000 will certainly remember what that looks like when it's quite bad. But also things like the Game Boy Advance AGS 101, the coveted backlit screen. Compared to the front-lit and non-lit Game Boy Advance, the motion clarity is dreadful. But as systems improved, as LCDs improved, we saw response times generally increase. And they're not amazing, but I think LCD technology has reached a point where motion is generally okay. And of course, you can do strobing and whatnot as well, which of course Nintendo is not going to touch due to fear of flicker, I'm sure. The problem with Switch 2 is that the response time of the pixels, or at least the way it's being driven, is not adequate. And as a result, you actually do see a lot of sort of trails, blur on things. So if you're playing, say, a side-scrolling 2D platform game, like imagine you're playing Sonic on there, Sonic Mania, you got this checkerboard field, you've got a lot of contrasting colors. As it moves, the image essentially leaves behind. If you film at, say, 240 frames per second for like a slow motion video, you essentially get 4 individual ghost images of everything on the screen. Your eyes perceive this as blur. It's actually slower than the original Switch 1 LCD from 2017. This is what surprised me the most, because the nature of modern LCDs, I'm genuinely confused as to how this is the case. It shouldn't be that much worse, but it is. And as a result, it means that 2D games especially, or anything with a lot of lateral motion, just kind of smears in a messy way. And so I had some theories. My first thought was that, maybe it's doing 60 hertz in a 120 hertz container. But that really, on a sample and hold display, that shouldn't cause that much extra blur. It only becomes an issue if you're on a low persistence display. So I don't think it's that. What I think instead is happening is just there's a possibility that they're not performing any sort of overdrive on the image, right? So there's like a technique like LCD overdrive that can be used to sort of adjust sort of the extra response time of the pixels. Actually, I'm not entirely sure how that works, to be honest. I haven't looked into that, but it does seem to help. And there are other devices such as Apple's iPad, the mini LED iPads, for instance, some of the older iPad screens, they do not perform any sort of overdrive, and they have noticeably more blur in motion than a lot of other LCDs tended to. And there is things with overdrive. If you go too far, it actually causes sort of like a reverse ghost image effect. So
Overshoot.
Overshoot, right? So it requires some sort of adjustment. But I think that as a result of that, if they implemented some sort of firmware-based overdrive into the Switch 2, they could potentially improve the motion clarity issue. So I do have a little bit of hope. But right now...
Would that impact battery life, though?
What's that?
Would that impact battery life?
Frankly, it doesn't matter. It shouldn't impact it much, but it doesn't matter, because what good is extra battery life if the actual experience isn't very great, right? I would say the screen isn't good enough. It's so bad that for anything side-scrolling that's like Switch 1 still, I would much rather play on the Switch OLED than the Switch 2, and that's not a situation I expected to occur. So that is problem one, and that's the worst problem for me. The other problem I would say next up is HDR, or lack thereof. I think we've talked about this a little bit. The screen tops out at just over 400 nits, which is far too low for an HDR presentation. It is not capable of doing bright enough highlights or anything like that, let alone full field. It's an LCD. It should be able to drive itself much brighter, of course, at the expense of battery life. But it could still be okay enough if they actually had a backlight that was designed to allow this, but they're using a single sort of all-encompassing backlight rather than sort of dimming zones, because the whole thing about HDR is you need to be able to control the individual pixels and the brightness of them. So if you have like a star field, you want space to be pitch black, you want a star to appear bright white. But if they're all sharing the same backlight, how do you do that? You really can't, right? You got to ramp up that overall brightness, and then the black becomes washed out while the star's bright, or vice versa. So you're not really getting an HDR presentation on here right now, which I was kind of hoping we would actually see. So that's another bummer. So those are the two main issues that I have with it, really. And, you know, there's a couple other complaints I might throw out there as far as it being an LCD, right? I'm not an LCD fan, everyone knows. But I will say, if I compare motion clarity to the Switch 1, I will at least say that it is a big improvement over Switch 1, the original Switch 1 LCD, in terms of color reproduction, even though it does fall very much on the cooler spectrum. You don't get warm color temperature. It's very cool, but it is more colorful. It's more vibrant, and the screen material itself, due to the way it's fused to the glass, I guess, it actually appears black. So when the screen is off, it's just a black looking image. Physically, whereas the original Switch had a very gray, washed out looking screen, like whether it was on or not, like if light touched that screen, it was gray looking, which was very, very bad for contrast. That's not an issue here. So like at a glance, you know, it looks brighter, it looks more colorful, it doesn't have that issue. You would actually think it's significantly better all around. But yeah, compared to the Switch OLED, it's just not there right now, and that is currently the biggest disappointment. So, and then lastly, the resolution stuff. I would say the jump to 1080p, I was worried about uneven pixel scaling, and that's technically an issue, but the size is small enough and the pixel density high enough that it's not that noticeable in practice. And in fact, most Switch 1 and Switch 2 games look pretty good on here already. We're seeing more games target higher resolutions in portable mode than I expected, and there is even some Switch 1 titles that already did 1080p in portable mode, which I didn't expect. Like you look at something like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the recent brawler that I absolutely loved, right? Shredder's Revenge, that actually rendered 1080p in portable mode. And as a result, the pixels look super sharp and they actually scale better because the game's internal resolution was something like 270p originally. So it actually scales up perfectly to 1080, so the game looks better. Not every game gets this, but it's cool when you see it, and I do appreciate that. But that's generally my thoughts on the screen as a whole, I would say. But I know Oliver, So you come from a different perspective. I'm crazy for OLED screens. I don't really like LCD technology at all. But the Switch 2 is worse, much worse than usual for an LCD screen, and I think it would probably fail if like ratings or something, ratings.com did a review of
Yeah.
it would be trashed by them. But Oliver, you love LCDs, so I want to hear what your take is on this one.
I love LCDs, you're right. I don't necessarily love this LCD. It's exceptional in some ways that you've already described. But I'll go through some positive points. So first of all, the screen, as you can see here, very large. It's a very large screen. It's almost as big as the PS Portals. I think it's very immersive. For me, I kind of think this relative to the 7-inch screen of the SWOLED, I think it is a more immersive experience, but I think this is probably about the limit of what I would consider reasonable for a handheld device, just holding at a comfortable distance from your face. I think this is probably right about that limit. Maybe even I go a little bit smaller, but this is fine too. This feels good. It also has 120 hertz support, which is quite nice, and VRR, which we'll touch on later, but those are two nice features to have. Obviously, their applicability in most software is relatively limited so far, but those are some nice features to have. Games, like John said, they actually do a pretty good job of servicing the 1080p panel, at least a lot better than I thought they would. There are a lot of titles like Pokemon, Hogwarts, even Fast Fusion to some degree, that are upscaling to 1080p on that panel with a technique like DLSS, and they're actually achieving a pretty good level of image quality in stills. Now, Notion, some of those titles fall apart a little bit more, especially in Fast Fusion, which is like an extreme stress test. But I was a lot more skeptical of that panel resolution pre-launch. I think a lot of games actually do a good job targeting that panel. The only real pain point there is all those Switch 1 titles that do run at 720p. That is a little bit annoying, getting that scaling blur. Like John said, the unit itself seems to have a pretty cool color temperature. I don't mind that, but it is one of the coldest displays I have around here by default. It is definitely pretty cold. It's probably, my guess is above 7500K. It's a pretty cold white point there on my unit. My Switch 1 or OG launch unit was really cool as well, but my SWOLED was kind of warm. It was more like 6000 or so to my eyes. So that was an interesting change. I'm not exactly sure if Nintendo has like a theory of the case behind that. I know that Apple calibrates all their displays to a certain relatively warm white point. I don't know what Nintendo's feeling is there. I like the color on it, and I also think the viewing angles are quite good. Like, if you go back to the Switch 1, it had an IPS display. It didn't have very good viewing angles, but this right here, looking at it now, it's very good off-axis. It's not as good as an OLED, but it's pretty good. But yeah, for the negatives, the panel is quite laggy, as John mentioned. It's actually a bit laggier than a Switch 1. I did a bunch of tests with the 180 FPS camera, and especially in like 2D content like the home screen or virtual game card library, or even like panning the camera in a 3D game like I got Mario Sunshine here, you can really see that blur. You can kind of see that it's like got maybe 3 or even 4 frames of like that kind of ghosting behind the image, and that's like really not good. It's way worse than the SWOLED, and it's noticeably worse, I would say, than the original Switch unit. For HDR content, it doesn't really have the brightness that HDR is intended for, nor the kind of control. Like John said, you really want to have, if not per pixel backlight control, then at least per zone backlight control on many LEDs. Oftentimes we're seeing, 300, 400 up to, I think I have a monitor that has 1152 dimming zones on it, so you can go pretty high with the dimming zones. I think my MacBook Pro has like over 2000 dimming zones, so you can go pretty nuts with these things. You can get a pretty good HDR experience. That's not really the case here. The peak brightness is quite low as well. I did do some analysis, some brief subjective analysis of like Fast Fusion, and the difference is pretty subtle between HDR and non-HDR and SDR rather. You get a little bit brighter highlights in HDR mode, but like if you compare that to the kind of difference you'd see on a good HDR monitor like my BenQ, or like a decent HDR TV like my Samsung Q-N90D, it's a huge difference between those bright areas and those dimmer areas in Fast Fusion. It has a really impactful, really bright HDR presentation, very deep contrast between the less bright areas of the image and the brighter areas of the image, and that's just not the case there. So yeah, I mean, I think you can keep it on if you want to, but it's not going to make much of a difference either way. So overall, like, I think it's pretty middling for mobile display in 2025. It's not anywhere near a SWOLED or a Steam Deck OLED, certainly. I think it's better than the original Switch panel by some margin, just because of the, it's larger. Like John said, the appearance of contrast in like bright rooms is better. But it's not an even across the board thing, because like the panel response is just not very good. It's just a little bit It's a little bit laggy. I've gotten used to it by this point because I've used it so much, but it was like genuinely shocking. And I was like messaging John, like, this is a really laggy display within a couple days of me having it, because it was something that I picked up on, and I'm not usually sensitive to these kinds of response time issues. So yeah, just a few notes there. I think it's just kind of like I feel like it's the bare minimum they could have shipped outside of the feature level support they have. Just in terms of panel quality, it's not really there.
I think in summary, my views on this, I mean, what can I say? The one thing we've got to remember is that consoles are built to a price, and it's particularly challenging to get a competitive price point with the way, consumer electronics are priced these days. So something has to give. Unfortunately, they built the whole marketing around stuff like, 120 hertz and specifically HDR, and they've not delivered HDR. That's a problem. Secondly, the Switch OLED obviously had a much better screen. So there's something of a Series S about the Switch 2 in that, that shipped with a worse GPU than the premium model of the prior generation, the Xbox One X. And you could feel it in that initial generation of games. And here we're seeing pretty much the same thing where, we thought we'd moved on to the Switch OLED as the default, and then we've come on to Switch 2, and the screen overall, I think, just isn't as good as an OLED. And, you put the VRR, for example, Cyberpunk, if you put the HDR experience, rather, up against the Steam Deck OLED, it's just will be a night and day difference, because that's a proper HDR screen. The other thing, of course, is that we just know that a few years down the road, we're going to get that premium upgrade option. We're going to have the ability to have a Switch 2 with an OLED. It's going to happen. So, it's slightly upsetting that, it's not an option right now. But I guess it is what it is. Right, so another key part of the screen experience beyond the HDR and, of course, the 120 hertz is VRR, variable refresh rate. Now, the concept here is that the GPU takes control of when the screen refreshes, in theory, producing smoother gameplay when the frame rate isn't at a straight 60, 30, or indeed 120 hertz. Lots to talk about on this one. But, John, let's talk about the welcome tour, because we actually get a pretty fully featured VRR demonstration there, which kind of shows the experience, I guess, at its best.
Yeah, so I guess the usefulness of the welcome tour in this case is that it essentially proves to us that VRR actually does work, right? Because based on what you guys are about to say, without this demo, there would be a lot more questions up in the air about what VRR and the Switch 2 actually can do. But thanks to the welcome tour, you can take it down into single digit frame rates, and it covers the full range. So it actually does switch on low frame rate compensation after a certain point, and you do get the full range of VRR that looks exactly what you would hope, right? So you get the full up to 120 frames per second, down to 2 or whatever it was. You can do it. And so it works. And that's key, is that we know that it works. It behaves as it should. We all know what VRR displays look like, what they should produce. Obviously, the idea is that when it's not divisible by the refresh rate, it's actually changing the refresh rate to display the frames without judder, or without doubling up frames, essentially.
Yeah.
So without that, if you displayed 40 FPS or about 39 FPS, you would get plenty of single 16 millisecond frames, and then you would get 33 millisecond frames, and that's what causes the judder. It's no problem here. But unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case with actual shipping games, right?
Yeah, I mean, Oliver, we've both tested this. Maybe you want to take point on this. Which game shall we begin with? Because we tested three major ones, really. Cyberpunk 2077, Hitman World of Assassination, and No Man's Sky, all of which have the option, at least, for unlocked frame rates, which should, in theory, deliver a VRR experience, right?
I think Hitman is most interesting, at least to me, because Hitman, if you look at this footage here, it's an unlocked game, and it appears to be unlocked in both portable and docked configurations. You can see here we're kind of typically 35 to 45 FPS docked, but in portable mode, in this, the start of a mission in Hitman 3 here, If I swing the camera around, it's very smooth as we pan over the countryside. But when we get to that castle, when the camera is over that castle, all of a sudden it becomes very jerky. So I did count a brief cluster of frames during one of those drops where it feels jerky, and it looks to be running in the mid to upper 30s during that period.
Right.
So what's going on here is I don't think VRR is working properly with LFC. And it may be the case that VRR is working properly up to, down to 40 hertz, but past 40 hertz, it's no longer working correctly. And indeed, the welcome tour seems to indicate this. I believe what it does, like when you set the frame rate to 2 FPS, it says it's running at 40 hertz with 2 FPS LFC'd to 40 hertz, right? So there's some indication there that it's actually the minimum floor of that VRR would be 40 hertz, which is the same as it is, I believe, on Xbox commonly through FreeSync.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
So that would certainly make some sense. The other games are, to me, a little bit less interesting. So I tried Cyberpunk 2077 in performance mode, which notionally goes up to 40 FPS, and it suffers from some pretty inconsistent camera travel. So I'm not sure that VR is working correctly there. Again, it's frequently dropping frames, or at least we believe it is, based off of its performance in dock mode. Probably not reaching a full 40 FPS very often there. I also tried No Man's Sky, which is maybe a little bit more interesting. So planet side, it does seem to suffer from some bigger camera issues, some stutters just moving around. But in the space stations, in the anomalies, space stations, areas like that, not planet side, it seems smoother. So I counted one out by hand using high frame rate footage, and it counted to about 40 FPS. So there it was a little bit harder to tell if VR was working correctly or not. But I do almost feel a small range of frame rate smoothness, maybe between like 30 and 40 FPS-ish. When I'm panning around planet side, I'm getting a little bit more fluidity when I'm looking up at the sky than I am looking straight ahead. Maybe that's in my head, I don't know, it's hard to tell exactly. But I think that there probably is some degree of VRR working correctly there, at least that's how it feels to me. But there are some occasional intermittent issues that just come from the complexity of this game. I'd have to imagine if VRR was working correctly, that's where the stutters are coming from. So yeah, I think overall it does seem like maybe VR is working properly on the system level, but you need developers to kick in LFC, which is a similar situation as we see on PlayStation. That could be the situation here. So it could just be like this early wave of software, but overall we're not getting a very good VR experience in these early titles, especially in key titles like Hitman, where they're running the game totally unlocked, right? That's one example. And they really kind of should have VR to smooth that out. I mean, they should have a frame rate cap, in my opinion. But, if you're going to use VR, you should be smoothing that out. And they're not doing that at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about frame rate caps, Oliver, and we do have them in Cyberpunk 2077 in the form of the quality mode. Mm-hmm. And similarly, No Man's Sky, you can engage locked frame rate mode. And I don't know whether you agree, but I played both of those in both unlocked and locked modes. And even though locked is delivering a lower frame rate, 30 frames per second, perceptually it's smoother and looks better to my eyes than running unlocked with quote unquote VRR. So in the case where it is an option there, I wouldn't be using what we would consider to be VRR. It just doesn't look as good, right?
Right. No, you're absolutely right, and that's fundamentally the issue. Is that you're getting these. So this is actually, I like to look at this as like the 2013 problem. When PlayStation 4 first launched, it felt like every developer was like, we can do 60 FPS now, but they couldn't. And you were getting all these games where they were just unlocking the frame rate, right? Like Sony first party was really guilty of this too. There was Knack, there was Killzone Shadowfall, and then there was infamous Second Son. And this kind of just kept happening. And it was the same problem. It was like this 30 to 40 FPS frame rate. It didn't look smooth, quite frankly. And that was due to lack of VR, which is why the fact that they would ship this without proper low frame rate compensation VRR, which seems to be possible, is so baffling. Because they can do it, at least on portable mode, right? But they don't.
Yeah.
And so, like, I guess the questions to raise then is, like, why? Like, what is it about the implementation that caused this? Were they even aware that it wasn't working properly? Is there something in there that makes it more difficult to implement that they weren't able to put in there? Like, that's the kind of questions I'm wondering about, because as if I was working on a product like this and this was an available feature, I feel like you would want to leverage this, right? Especially given the unlocked nature of these frame rates, especially Hitman. And they do kind of leverage it. But that also made me wonder, though, does Switch 2 have sort of like PS5, like where up to that certain point, it's automatic. But if you actually want to take advantage of low frame rate compensation, the developer has to do extra work. So maybe we're just seeing like an automatic function that does work without any developer input down to like 40 FPS. And then if you actually want the full range, you got to actually implement it. And maybe they haven't done that.
Yeah, it's all conjecture at the moment.
Right. We don't know. Really know. We have no idea.
However, if it was like a fully fledged system feature, you would expect VRR to also work on Switch 1 games running under the backwards compatibility layer. And I did test this. Dragon Quest Builders 2 is highly volatile. And, even when you're sort of notionally in the sort of 40 to 60 FPS territory, there's no VRR there. And Minecraft is an interesting one because you can actually adjust a frame rate cap at 5 FPS intervals, which is really interesting. And so, I was able to test 35, 40, 45, 50 frames per second. Camera pan, you can tell it's not VRR. So Switch 1 games definitely aren't using VRR, perhaps indicative that there isn't a sort of system level override for VRR. Whether that extends to Switch 2 games, we don't really know. So early days on this one. Clearly the feature is in there and working because the welcome tool proves it. But the actual implementation in other games so far, I'd say it's disappointing. Any final words, Oliver?
No, just to emphasize a point that I think people miss sometimes, which is like most console software is running flat for the most part at 30, 40, or 60. And that is the case with a lot of early Switch 2 titles, or it seems to be the case. Now, maybe a title like Mario Kart, I mean, it would be hard for me to tell, right? But maybe Mario Kart is like dipping to 55 FPS in some moments, right? In Switch 2 in portable mode. And there are probably some examples of that right now that we're not yet aware of, just because it would be very, very time consuming to try to track that kind of thing down. But in general, games on consoles, typically they're targeting these frame rates. And as long as there isn't some like inclement spike in GPU or CPU load, they don't really need VR necessarily if they're well targeted, if they're working correctly. It's just in these kind of inclement scenarios like a title like Cyberpunk, which might just be too heavy to always stay within a 25 millisecond window, for instance, in performance mode. Or a title where the developers just decide, okay, we're not going to cap it, we're just going to let it roll unlocked, right? Those are some scenarios in which VR can help you a lot. And here it does not seem to be helping you as much as we'd like, if at all, in some of those games. So this is an area where I'd like to see some improvement. In theory, this should be improvable because of what we see in the Welcome Tour, at least, which does exhibit very, very compelling LFC down to 2 FPS.
Just rounding off the sort of display discussion here, we've got to talk about the HDMI output options of the docked experience, because this too is not quite where we thought it would be. John?
Well, it's both not quite where we thought it would be, but also better than where we thought it would be. So let me start with the good part. So it turns out the dock does seem to support essentially HDMI 2.1 level output, which I didn't expect given some of the limitations in play. How is this known? Well, essentially HDMI 2.0 is limited to a maximum bandwidth of 18 gigabits per second, right? The Switch 2 can actually send full 4 lanes, 444, I guess RGB, 4K 60 to the display. Calculating it out, I think it's like something like 24 gigabits per second. It's above the 18 gigabits per second limitation of HDMI 2.0. So we're actually in that 2.1 territory, which is really interesting. So it's actually, the positive thing there is you actually do get that full quality of the output with no chroma subsampling. So all color channels are full resolution. So image quality definitely benefits from this. But of course you might say, well then what's up with the 120 hertz output and what's going on with VRR? And so I think we mentioned this before, but on the VRR side, I do think that there is an display. So the USB-C video protocols they're using here is converting DisplayPort to HDMI, right? And as I found out myself just this week, in fact, when experimenting with DisplayPort to HDMI from my PC, that does not work well. There's a lot of weird limitations and issues there. Even if the bandwidth is supported, things like VRR don't really play nicely in that conversion. And I suspect that there's some sort of issue there related specifically to that that they decided to leave VRR out, because theoretically it should work, but in practice it never seems to. So that could explain that. But the 120 hertz thing, that is a little bit confusing, because unless there's some other limitation on the bandwidth that we're not aware of here, but they should theoretically be able to get 4K 120 hertz output. But currently that's not the case. It's limited to a maximum of 1440p at 120. But what's really curious about that, a lot of displays, including all the LG OLED lineup TVs, they don't report themselves as being capable of 1440p 60. So if you go into the switch information and try to change the resolution, you'll see 1440p is not available. It's grayed out. But if the system switches to 120 hertz mode, and then you go check the information again, you'll see, oh wait, it actually can and does trigger 1440p 120. So it's allowing it to do it at 120 hertz, but because the EDID doesn't report 1440p 60, it doesn't actually show up as an option. So that could be confusing to some users. And also further still, once you throw AV equipment into the mix, things can also get weirder, and you might end up limited to 1080p 120. So all the stuff related to 120 hertz output is a little bit weird, confusing at this point, and not where it should be, right? And even if the system, look, you're not doing 4K 120 on the Switch 2, but you're also not really doing that much on the Series S, right? And the Series S allows you to do 4K 120 output, which is preferable. You don't want any sort of additional scaling, multiple scaling happening, right? It would be great if just the system did all scaling for you. That would be cool, but it doesn't. But there's also weird issues when coming out of software with 120 hertz, where it'll kind of like the system kind of gets stuck in one mode or the other depending on what you last played, which is not optimal in a lot of cases, especially if you're using black frame insertion, like I sometimes do on these games, especially because it's a non-VRR system. So the way they handle all the settings, I think, is the sloppiest of all the console manufacturers, I would say. Like Xbox, I think, gives you the most granular control. PlayStation has improved, and they have a good amount of control, but it still can be a little finicky from time to time. And the Switch 2 is just, it's acceptable enough, but it could be better, I would say. So that is kind of where we're at there. The other issue, though, I want to lay out, and this, if you really want more detail on this, let me recommend Vincent at HDTV Test, who always does amazing work on this. And he did a great video on this, where there's the Switch 2's HDR output to the TV. It is needlessly confusing and not very well designed. So first of all, the first screen sort of determines the maximum light output that your TV is capable of. And normally, like on PS5, for instance, you have X amount of steps between the lowest level and the highest level. And it's not like a ridiculous number of steps. It's granular enough, but it's like you're kind of going up through it. Here, it's like literally like hundreds of clicks that you can go up and down through the range. So it's very, very, very granular, but almost needlessly so, which can make it hard to perfectly like get the settings you want without being a little bit sort of frustrated by the results, because there's a certain point where you're like, wait, is it above the line, below the line? What's the exact light output? Without an ability to measure this for yourself, you may not know, and you can't necessarily match it to your screen. But then there's that following screen where it says set the brightness, and it just shows a picture of Super Mario Wonder, and you can cycle through a couple pictures as well, right? I think this really got a lot of people, because I believe what this sets is the Paperwhite. Paperwhite, of course, you've heard around, which like they recommend around 200 nits, which I think is a little low. I'm more of a 300 nit Paperwhite guy. I like that. That could be a t-shirt. I don't know, a 300 nit Paperwhite guy. But it doesn't tell you that on that screen. And I think, like most users, including myself, when you first get the system, just because you see that random image there, it's like, oh, I'll just turn this brightness up. That looks pretty good, right? And then you actually go to play a game like Mario Kart World, supporting HDR, and you find like, wait a minute, all the highlights are blown out. Everything's way too bright. Contrast floors, right? Like, what's going on here? The image quality looked bad, to the point where you're like, maybe I should just disable HDR. But it turns out, because it is actually the Paperwhite setting, but it doesn't actually tell you what kind of nits you're getting out of it, you kind of gotta fudge it a little bit and figure it out. And this is where Vincent's video comes in, because he actually takes the time to count every single step on a variety of displays. He does the math and kind of figures out, based on your type of TV you're using, this is kind of ballpark where you should be, put these settings in. But it shouldn't be like this. And I feel like a lot of people are going to get tripped up by this, especially with the users Nintendo's targeting, especially if Switch 2 is their first real HDR gaming system. I think most people are just going to turn that brightness slider all the way up, and everything's going to look wrong. And I think that sucks. They should really alter the process to make it more clear to users what's going on and why these settings are selected. So that's basically my take on the current HDMI output. So sorry for the long-windedness there, but I think all of that's super important to understanding what the Switch is doing with the video to your TV.
Do you have anything to add to that, Oliver, at all?
Not too much. My only comment is that, I do think that the lack of VRR in docked mode is kind of a downer, but it really depends on how developers implement that feature, obviously. Because like in some titles, you have titles like Hitman, which are fully unlocked, which I'm not a big fan of. Obviously, with VR, that's kind of okay. Without VR, it's really unpleasant. I think in general, it matters a lot less for a console than it does for a PC, but at the same time, the Switch 2 has such a weak CPU and GPU that you can imagine some scenarios in which there's like no margin of dynamic resolution or no margin of CPU sparing techniques that could really get you to a 16 millisecond update or a 33 millisecond update or a 25 millisecond update at 40 FPS or whatever. So I could definitely see it being really important. But overall, I mean, the Switch 2's display features, I've been okay with them. I think the thing that I'm happiest with the most is that the system does switch you automatically into 120 hertz mode. So if you're playing in 4K 60 and you load up a game with 120 hertz support, it will kick you into 120 hertz. But I do take a little bit of issue with that too, because if you're playing a game like Cyberpunk, it will automatically kick you into 120 hertz just because the game has 120 hertz support, period, right? Whereas on the PlayStation side, if you're playing a game with 120 hertz support, it would kick you to 120 hertz based on the mode. So you could be playing at 4K 60 and then maybe 4K 120. And that obviously wouldn't be a huge issue on the Nintendo side of things, except that it obviously does not support 4K 120. So it does matter quite a lot to your perceived image quality, at least in software that is going to be targeting high output resolutions, if you do actually have that 4K 60 output. So that's my only note on the display end of things. And that's something I think Nintendo probably could correct. But in the interim, I would kind of just suggest maybe leave it to 4K 60 and don't turn on that toggle unless you really know what the game is doing and you really want it. It kind of is going to depend on the game. Maybe you could leave it on, maybe you could leave it off, but you do need to be aware there is potentially a trade-off there in some titles, potentially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, the Welcome Tour does switch between 60 and 120 as required by the software.
Yeah.
So developers can actually switch between those modes. So it should be better, right?
Whereas like Street Fighter 6, for instance, it has the 120 hertz mode, which is purely for input latency differences, but it doesn't allow you to switch it in the game like the other console versions. It's done at the system level. So if you don't want that mode, you got to go into your system menu and turn off 120 hertz mode, which, again, a little hassle.
Okay, good stuff. Well, let's move on. And we're going to be talking about power efficiency and power consumption on the Switch 2. Ultimately, an extremely important thing for a handheld machine, but also gives you some idea of how much they're going to be pushing the system when docked, when you don't have to worry about the battery anymore. And I took point on this testing, and there are some really fascinating results. I mean, this system is super, super efficient. And this is actually quite a turn up for the books because the main processor, T239, it is fabricated on an 8 nanometer, potentially 10 nanometer Samsung process. And when this initially leaked or was suggested, there were big concerns about this. They were saying it couldn't possibly be such a chip because it would simply require too much power. And this was based on observations made from the T234 processor that NVIDIA created for the automotive business. Turns out, I don't think we really should have been too concerned about that.
You were right too, Rich. That's important to note.
Well, that was basically where the volume of evidence was pointing towards. So, ultimately, you've got to understand that the engineers creating the T239 would have known about this and would have built the chip around it. So yes, I mean, this is kind of like the killer shot, which I think a lot of people may well be sharing. And it is one of our Cyberpunk 2077 benchmark tests. It's actually an internal CD Projekt Red test that's available in all versions of the game. And we've got the Switch 2 on the left there in its 40 FPS performance mode, and we've got the PlayStation 5 in its 60 FPS performance mode on the right there. And Switch is using like circa 21 watts overall, 30 to 40 FPS, a relatively low resolution, but I'd say the image is still pretty acceptable thanks to that DLSS upscaling. Now, on the right there, PlayStation 5, a huge resolution boost there, and FSR 2.1 upscaling to 1800p. But, look at the power differential there. It's an order of magnitude above that, in fact. Ooh. The Switch 2 is using 10% or lower of the PlayStation 5's power. And that's the slim model that I'm using there with the 6 nanometer process. Although I will say my PlayStation 5 Slim, I've basically bummed out on the silicon lottery there because that power consumption should be lower. It's about the same as a launch unit, if not higher. Even so, I think this kind of proves out the point of what Switch 2 is all about. It's basically Switch 1 bumped up a generation, if you like. You can run modern games on it, but there are going to be compromises. But it still should, in theory, look pretty good if the developers know what they're doing, while it's using a tiny fraction of the power used by the other consoles. And this basically opens the door to, a handheld actually being possible, the whole hybrid console concept. Now, there's going to be big caveats with that when we talk about some of the games that are primarily designed for the current generation. Because if we think about it, Cyberpunk is immensely scalable, but it did run on a Xbox One VCR. Not very well, but it did do it. When we start talking about games like Star Wars Outlaws, then we'll be seeing possibly a bit more of a challenge to the Switch 2 there. Anyway, 20 to 22 watts there for docked performance on a game that's you'd think be stressing the GPU and CPU. And I actually reran that test with quality and performance mode. Pretty much the same result, actually. DRS, dynamic resolution scaling on the GPU, basically means that you're seeing full occupancy of the resources in both modes there. They're both drawing the same amount of power, which we think is pretty much the sort of limit. Now, there are obviously going to be some games that aren't going to be using all system resources. So I actually used Bayonetta 3 running in backwards compatibility for the next test, where I do think that the Switch 2 actually gives Switch 1 games as much of its performance as possible. But in this case, once you hit 60 frames per second, it doesn't need to use all of those resources. So I actually had power draw maxing out at about 13 watts on this one. Switch 1 code through the translation layer, full system resources capped by VSync, and that's what we're getting there, about 13 watts max, but it does vary. Something I did want to talk about, though, to sort of prove out that you are getting close to full system resources, Dragon Quest Builders 2. This is a game that runs at 1080p resolution on Switch 1, and it's also the case that you can bring in user-created content from versions of the game that, running on PS5 or whatever, where obviously it's going to bring performance down to a crawl on the Switch 1. The Switch 2 obviously does a lot better, but it's still, when you're talking about a 7-8 frames per second average on the Switch 1, you're only going to get so much out of the Switch 2. But I think I saw something like a 2.3 times performance increase in this test and a peak power draw of 18.5 watts. So it can use a lot of power, basically, if it's required. One more thing to talk about. Obviously, when you're playing handheld and you run out of juice, and you can actually continue your session just by docking and continuing on from there with your TV. Interestingly, I didn't see any increase to power draw because you'd expect gameplay wattage plus charging wattage, but it seems to be the case that there's a cap on that sort of 22 watt limit, and the battery doesn't really charge at all while you're gaming in those scenarios. it will be charging, but an extremely slow rate. However, if you're playing handheld and you're running low on juice and then you plug in, then you actually get the highest power draw that I noticed of all, which came to about 25 watts. Which brings me on to the case of what happens when you actually have fully charged, but you're still plugged in. If you're actually playing handheld and you've completed charging, in theory, the power draw is just going to be like what the system requires, right? And so I tested that with Cyberpunk 2077 just outside Dogtown and starting off a massive fight just to sort of see what would happen there. Power draw 10 to 12 watts, which considering, Cyberpunk in 10 to 12 watts with a handheld screen to power as well, all of that stuff. It's pretty remarkable stuff, I'd say. However, the power draw is actually lower than that because you're contending with the inefficiency of the power supply as well. So it's actually going to be lower than that. And the way to test that is actually with battery life tests, because we know that we've got a 19.75 watt hour battery within the Switch. So you see how long the system runs before it shuts down, and then you can kind of work back how much power it was using. I actually started off with Mario Kart World. I just loaded the game and then just left it running on the intro screens. It goes through basically a series of sort of gameplay segments in turn. Pretty good battery test, I'd say. You get, I got 2 hours, 33 minutes there, 7.8 watts total system consumption overall there. For a handheld, that's astonishing, especially particularly when you're looking at a game here that runs so well, full resolution, just what can I say, just brilliant. No Man's Sky I tested next because that runs unlocked. I believe it actually runs unlocked up to 40 frames per second. There's some VRR stuff going on there. For me, that lasted for 2 hours, 23 minutes, which is way more than I expected. Typically, when you're thinking about a game running unlocked, you're also thinking about a game running with full system resources. And Nintendo has said, minimum battery life of 2 hours there. I mean, 2 hours, 23, 8.3 watts. That's pretty astonishing. I did try Cyberpunk, but here's the thing, right? In Dogtown, I tried a couple of locations, and I actually got battery lives of 2 hours 16 and 2 hour 31, which again is like astonishingly low, much lower than the 10 to 12 watts we were talking about earlier. The thing is, though, it crashed in both cases, and I believe there's actually a memory leak in Cyberpunk because performance seems to get progressively worse the longer the bench sort of continued, and it was literally just sitting in Dogtown spinning around on the spot. It just got progressively worse and worse, and then in one run it shut down. It just crashed, and in the other run it did finish at 2 hours 31, but when I redocked to continue the play, performance was much lower than it was when I started. So I think there's a memory leak there, so I can't really attach too much validity to that result. But ultimately I think Nintendo's minimum 2 hours of battery life must be pretty extreme testing based on what I've seen. I think 2 hours battery life is kind of okay. It's more than the original Steam Deck was when you're dealing with AAA fare. So yeah, I'm curious what you make of those results, Oliver.
There was a lot of hubbub pre-launch about battery life, but I think ultimately the battery life is not that bad. And that 2 hour mark really is an extreme lower bound for battery life. I would expect, in your tests here, 2.5 is going to be more typical even in very demanding scenarios. It's probably a bit worse than the OG Switch one in that really extreme scenario, but I think that given the processor Nintendo are using, given the battery size they're using, given the weight of the device they have, that's a really good result. People are really conditioned by the Marico Switch 2 and the SWOLED to expect 5+ hours of battery life out of these things. But, that launch model was not there at all. That launch model was not there. So I can see this being a bit of a disappointment in those terms. But for a launch model, you would expect big power consumption savings to come in later revisions, maybe a 5 nanometer revision or something down the line, maybe a 7 nanometer revision possibly down the line. I would expect that to improve. So I think this is pretty good. I also think with the Switch 2 being larger, there's probably a little bit less of a focus on keeping battery life within bounds, because this feels a little bit more like a PC handheld where you're going to need to accommodate it somewhat. You're not just going to take it around with you everywhere like a Switch Lite. It's something for a carrying case or a messenger bag, And maybe part of that accommodation that you have with the device is bringing a charger or bringing a battery bank or something like that. This actually, because it's so efficient, it can charge pretty well off a reasonably sized battery bank, unlike a Steam Deck or certainly like a ROG Ally or something, where you might be lugging around like a 70 or 100 watt hour battery bank and it's only going to power the system for a few hours, right? It's actually quite efficient to use it. So ultimately, I do think that this is a pretty good story in terms of battery life, but it really depends on where your expectations were. You know, if you have memories of that Switch 1 2017 unit like I do, you're going to be pretty fine with this. But if you're coming from a SWOLED, you might be a little bit peeved. But I kind of see it either way. It's fine to see it either way, but I think it's reasonable for a launch unit here.
Mm-hmm. John, thoughts?
I mean, not to add too much to it because you said so much on the topic, but I'm super impressed by just the efficiency of this thing. And I think that, like, when you put up that comparison showing the PS5 Slim against the Switch 2, and it's literally using 10 times less power for what is functionally a relatively similar kind of experience, that's pretty darn awesome. So this is really great in that regard. And battery life wise, you know, it's pretty much where I expected. And like, I feel like any sort of new handheld gaming system over the last 20 years, even, like, this is typically where we end up early on, right? Like, going back to the PSP, everybody had these same kind of concerns. And guess what? It was similar to the Switch 2 is today, similar to that Switch 1 launch model. I mean, this is just kind of what you get. And I'm just thankful we have rechargeable batteries in these things since then, because the Game Gear was worse than this, and that did not have rechargeable batteries out of the gate.
Wow.
So
yep,
it's not a big deal, and of course it does. That's testing it with heavier loads, right? And you're playing less demanding software, you get more battery life as you'd expect. So, for my money, it's actually been perfectly fine so far in testing it. So yeah.
One final battery life test I did do was actually running the Witcher 3 under backwards compatibility. I just basically had Geralt in the middle of Novigrad, just circling round, camera round. So this is basically an idea of taking a Switch 1 game, running it under backwards compatibility, but also where we're looking for big performance improvements over the original experience. That lasted for me 2 hours, 55 minutes, which is basically like 6.8 watts, which I think is really, really good. I think that, you know, what can I say? The power efficiency of this thing is quite impressive, I'd say. The one area where, and this is just a kind of perceptual niggle that I've got at the moment. It's not borne out by data because the data is quite difficult to actually gather. I don't know what you think about this, Oliver, but I think the battery drain under sleep might be quite a lot higher than the Switch. I don't know whether that's simply because I am probably coming off Switch OLED. But yeah, that's something I'd quite like to look into there because it seemed to be a bit onerous compared to prior systems. But no data there simply because you'd have to keep coming back to it momentarily to see how much the battery has reduced in the meantime. But yeah, that's where we're at with efficiency. And efficiency beast, I'd say, and the fact that they've actually managed this with an 8/10 nanometer processor, I think is speaks to the ingenuity of NVIDIA and Nintendo in putting this processor together. But let's move on. Let's talk about storage. The Switch comes with 256 gigabytes of, I think it's UFS 3.1 storage, right, Oliver?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, and but there are alternatives. You can obviously buy your games on cartridges and run them from there, and you can buy also MicroSD Express cards. They're a bit expensive, but I was actually supplied one by Nintendo, the SanDisk version of it, and we've got some loading time tests here on a couple of games. So we're going to kick off with Mario Kart World, I think. And yeah, I think there's sort of like a direction of travel that I could just rattle out the numbers, but you know, let's just keep it simple. Running the games from system memory, the UFS 3.1 storage that's built in delivers the fastest loading times pretty much across the board, as you might expect. This is followed up by the MicroSD Express results, which are kind of like maybe a second or two behind. The surprise for me is how poor relatively the cartridge performs compared to those other forms of storage. Significantly longer loading times there. So, taking, for example, loading Mario Kart World for the first time, 16.42 seconds on the system memory. MicroSD Express actually slightly lower, just under 16 seconds, but the cartridge was 25 seconds. So it's a good chunk more. That's probably, I'd say, Oliver, probably the longest load you'll have on Mario Kart.
Pretty much within the game, the loads between like areas when you're fast traveling, at least for me on the system storage there, it's like 4 seconds, 5 seconds. Like it's a very quick loading game, generally speaking.
Yeah, so, looking at I basically went to the first GP and cycled through loading in each of those initial races. And it's basically between 5 to 7 seconds on system memory. And it can go up it could be anything from like 8 to 12 seconds on the cartridge. And MicroSD Express is slightly slower than system memory overall. So, I think that's probably the route forward there. But it is a bit of a bummer that the sort of physical media version is actually the worst performing of the lot. I think it's probably was the same with Switch 1, thinking back.
It was, but not the gulf wasn't as large.
Right, yeah. So slightly disappointing there. And I also looked at Cyberpunk 2077, where actually the results closed up significantly. There wasn't really a vast amount of difference between any of them. The cartridge was still slower by a few seconds. Sometimes it actually matched the MicroSD Express results. But ultimately, it looks as though they did a pretty good job with loading there. It probably is the case that the decompression on the system side is probably the bottleneck there, as opposed to the storage medium. So that's where we're at there. Not really too much to say about that. I'd say, the cartridge being slow is a bit of a disappointment, but it's not likely to dramatically impede your experience unless we encounter some game that actually has incredibly long loading times on all of the media that we tested here. Obviously, the cartridge will then be like proportionately higher. But otherwise, I think, not bad, slightly disappointing on the cartridge side. But let's move on again. Let's talk about my bugbear for the Switch 1, thing that really annoyed me across the entire generation, Wi-Fi speed problems. Oliver, you looked at this one, right?
I did some testing comparing my Switch 2 and Switch OLED download speeds. The original Switch units were infamous for very, very poor download speeds with pretty poor Wi-Fi hardware. Over Wi-Fi, they were very glacial to download larger games, sometimes taking hours in my experience. If you look at the top line figures that I have here, the speeds are massively faster on Switch 2. So we have about 10 times the download speed over Wi-Fi in my setup compared to my OLED, and close to 5 times the download speed over Ethernet. So I'm using, just for context, I'm using a connection with 1.5 gigabits per second download speed for these tests, and the Wi-Fi tests are conducted about 12 feet away in another room. So that's kind of, to me, like somewhat representative. I mean, that's closer to an ideal scenario than I think most people would be in their typical Wi-Fi scenarios, but it's not too divergent from what might be realistic, I think. I actually did download a game over Wi-Fi here for my testing. In this case, I downloaded Persona 4 Golden, which is 9.1 gigabytes. That takes about 7 minutes on Switch 2, so not too bad there. But closer to 32 minutes on Switch 1. So that's a huge difference over Wi-Fi. Over Ethernet, we're talking about 5.5 minutes on Switch 2, so relatively speedy, and 12.5 minutes on Switch 1. So even wired in, it's over twice as fast. That's pretty cool. I also did a quick test playing Mario Kart 8 while downloading Persona 4, which took 41 minutes on Switch 1 and 6 minutes on Switch 2. So that's while playing a game, presumably while stressing the system somewhat. And in the background, I've got a download running, and it's actually running pretty fast on Switch 2. Now, of course, you do need to take into account the fact that on Switch 2 units, I believe, it's still the case that if a game is using network features, that it will stop downloads in the background. So if I was playing Mario Kart 8 over, the internet play, I presumably would not be able to do that, but at least playing the game locally, playing the game in single player mode, I was able to do that and get a pretty fast download there. So I know that people have complained about the Switch 2's Wi-Fi hardware. I'm not saying that it's perfect now or it's the fastest thing out there, but it is a lot faster than Switch 1. I didn't have any major issues walking around an apartment, going to different places, trying to get good Wi-Fi signal. I did not have any issues in my limited experience. Now, again, if you have a larger house, if you have a larger area to traverse, if you're going outside, maybe that's more of an issue. But for me, I did not have any particular problems there. And it was pretty comparable to my current generation consoles in terms of the Wi-Fi hardware that it has, in terms of the speeds I was getting. It was actually maybe a little bit faster for me than like my PlayStation 5, my Series X, a little bit faster than those consoles potentially over Wi-Fi, comparable over Ethernet. So yeah, I think it's a pretty positive story, but again, it depends on your point of reference. I'm not sure that it has the best Wi-Fi hardware out there, but relative to the Switch 1, it's a night and day difference. It's a really big difference, and I was pretty pleased with it overall.
Mm-hmm. I think the other thing which I found, well, let's just say it's a good idea, is that the dock actually has an Ethernet port this time.
Yeah.
Which it didn't last time, which I think is a good option to have, that you should have in case you don't get.
Didn't they add that to the Switch OLED?
The SWOLED had it, yeah.
Right.
Okay.
It was the original. You had to use the USB adapter.
Yeah, that's not great, is it?
No.
But yes, I mean, I'm glad it's better overall. I did have issues on launch day, but that might have been simply down to the servers being overwhelmed in terms of download speeds there. However, it did get noticeably better when I plugged it into Ethernet. I've got to say, my office is just chock full of like Wi-Fi traffic, so that's probably not going to be doing it any favors. Anything you want to add there, John?
I mean, I have a pretty complex room setup as well, but I found the Wi-Fi performance largely in line with what you said there, Oliver. It's definitely faster than the Wi-Fi on the other consoles for me, but I use wired for them primarily. Of course, consoles in general, I think, are also limited by their CPU and storage speeds in terms of how fast they can actually download things. So it never saturates my connection. I will say, though, that I still get superior download performance out of something like the Steam Deck. So downloading games from Steam through the Steam Deck is still a lot faster than on Switch 2. I mean, it's really fast downloading in the Steam Deck, which is awesome. But, you know, for Switch 2 games so far, it hasn't been a significant problem, I would say.
Okay, let's talk about backwards compatibility, where we've already established that the Switch 2 is throwing more system resources at Switch 1 games, resulting in better performance, which I think is pretty fantastic. It was one of our concerns going into this. I think we can sort of categorize how this all works by just throwing up a series of examples here. And we're going to kick off with the one that I actually put out a video about on launch day, which is two games, Batman Arkham Knight and The Witcher 3. Now, in these titles, both of them target 30 frames per second, but they're so challenging for various ways on the original Switch 1 that you rarely actually got there, specifically in those real stress test scenes like driving in the Batmobile or running around Novigrad in The Witcher 3. What that video showed is that pretty much all of those problems are sorted out. And I think this is sorted out in a number of ways. Obviously, the CPU is faster. Obviously, the GPU is faster, and you're getting GPU resources thrown at it to pretty much counter any situation there. I think that's pretty awesome stuff. I think the thing I want to point out, though, and it's really specific to Arkham Knight more generally, is that the stuttering was just so bad there. Maybe it's a storage thing, maybe it's a bandwidth thing, maybe it's a CPU thing. But to see pretty much all of that stutter completely resolved, it's pretty remarkable. The same with Novigrad in The Witcher 3 here. It just hums along. It just works at the intended 30 frames per second target. I think that's pretty impressive stuff. 60 frames per second games, if you're sort of like in a sort of 40 to 50 to 60 frames per second no man's land, as you are in Bayonetta and Bayonetta 3, etc., those games will just run locked at 60 frames per second on the Switch 2. I think that's pretty remarkable stuff. I think that's excellent. And yeah, I mean, in terms of finding the limits, just going to go back to Dragon Quest Builders 3 here, where you can see that differential, 7, 8, 9 frames per second on Switch 1. And, we're getting like a 2.3, 2.4 times performance increase on Switch 2 there. I mean, what I like about this comparison is that it actually shows you that it's not a bottomless pit of system resources that you've got available. Not everything will go to 60 frames per second, but you're seeing a performance increase there that is such that in most realistic scenarios, a game that can run at 60 frames per second will run at 60 frames per second. It's just, when you really sort of pile on the pressure, pile on the pain for those Switch 1 games, you will find the limits. And Dragon Quest Builders 2, that's the game that really does sort of define that limit there. Oliver, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so in general, like you said, games do run a lot fast. You get a pretty impressive multiple in terms of performance in games that are running with unlocked frame rates. On the Switch 1, I did some of my own testing. So I tested a lot of kind of trash. Okay, well, I don't want to say that. A lot of less polished games, perhaps. One of those games was Aqua Moto Racing Utopia.
Yes.
Which is kind of a wave race style game that I played. It goes from about 25 to 40 FPS on Switch 1, not a very good experience, to basically a locked 60 on Switch 2. Feels a lot better. Not an amazing game, but much more playable on Switch 2. XCOM 2, a kind of very challenged port of a bigger title, goes from about 20 FPS minimum here on Switch 1 to 60 FPS here with just brief stutters during intense camera movement on Switch 2, so runs a lot better there. Definitely a big multiple there in terms of performance. Resident Evil 5 is kind of one that's a little bit less challenged, but it goes from a wobbly 30 to 60 to a locked 60 on Switch 2. Again, feels great now. I was kind of upset they didn't include a 30 FPS cap before, but I'm actually pretty happy that it didn't include a 30 FPS cap now because it runs pretty well on Switch 2. I also tested some games that aren't supposed to work according to Nintendo because they have a list of games that have compatibility issues, games that won't start, things like that. So Star Wars Republic Commando, which is originally an Xbox and PC game, I believe, ran with pretty bad performance in the OG unit. For whatever reason, it was just like 40 to 60 FPS, 30 FPS, down as low as 20 FPS, I think, of the launch code. But on Switch 2, it performs a little bit better, a little bit higher frame rate. But it weirdly, the camera sometimes shoots up and you face the sky out of nowhere. So one frame you'll be facing forwards, and then one frame you'll be looking up at the sky. And then you have to move your camera back down. Very awkward, very bizarre. So that's obviously a compatibility issue with that title. Not intended. Grid Autosport is a game that I played quite a lot of on Switch 1. On the compatibility list as having issues, it crashes at launch. Very unfortunate. Trials Rising, another game on the compatibility list. It freezes for long periods at the start of certain events. So you'll load up an event, it'll freeze for like a minute in place, and then it'll start. So that's awkward. I did try a number of games though on the list that are supposed to have issues that I didn't spot immediate issues with. So like Crash Bandicoot, the Insane Trilogy, Insane Collection, Oddworld, Stranger's Wrath, WRC8, all those seem to run fine for me, but I was only playing for, a cursory amount of time, of course. I didn't have time to test in depth, but maybe there are some issues with those titles a little later on, but they were not obvious and immediate to me at least. One issue here, I think, is that Nintendo should at least have a warning that those games won't run on Switch 2, I feel, if not blocking it outright like Sony does in some cases, right? I feel like they should at least warn you that the games are not necessarily going to run fine, because I can just imagine, especially if you're someone with a larger collection, you have some of these games in your library, you're loading up these games, you weren't necessarily checking every single one against the Nintendo compatibility list, and so you're kind of left like frustrated and questioning like what's going on here. If you are playing one of those games and it does crash or it does have an issue, you're kind of wondering like, is there a problem with my unit? Do I need to reinstall it? Do I need to re-download it? Do I need to reset my system? What's going on here? So I wish they had some kind of OS level warning, at least telling you this game might not be fully compatible with your Switch 2 system. That's something I think they should implement. But outside of that, the backwards compatibility situation, I think we can all agree, has been better than I think we expected, judging from the pre-launch stuff. Nintendo did not really talk about this too much, but it actually turns out the backwards compatibility situation is a very good situation, kind of in line with what we get like on the PS5 or Series X when we're playing older titles. It is a big performance improvement.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the performance boost is similar, if not better, than what we saw between PS4 Pro and PS5, which we lauded at the time as being great. And it's the same here, really. I think it's pretty fantastic. What do you make of that, John? I mean, this is like a marketing point that Nintendo could have really hammered home here, and they didn't at all. It just left until launch to find out how these games ran.
Yeah, I'm just going to say it. This is the best backwards compatibility Nintendo has ever done. This is absolutely blows away everything, and they've had a lot of this over the years, but this is incredible. They've done a great job here, but it has shades of the PlayStation 5, where we were left with that exact same question, where we were like, "Oh, this is not going to be good." All signs pointing to this not working well, and then the system arrives, and we're like, "Wait, this is amazing! Like it's really good. It almost seems like limitless power." As we've learned, it's not, but it feels that way, as nearly every game just instantly maxes out their performance targets, which is fantastic. So I too am a little bit surprised by that, especially given the dearth of actual Switch 2 native software at launch and very little talks about future announcements. Like being able to say like, hey, this makes everything on Switch 1 way better is cool, but maybe they're afraid of making Switch 1 owners feel bad. I don't know. They don't want to hype that too much. Like, oh yeah, remember that crusty old Switch? We've got that beat. My experience has largely been in line with you guys, though. I've tested a few more obscure games, if you will. Maybe not obscure, but like, things that I really noticed, like some of the East games, for instance, from Falcom and other Falcom games, they all seem to support 1080p native on the screen, and it fixes all the performance profile problems that they've had, such as the recent remake of the Celseta no Jutai, whatever it was called, the English one. They released a new version of that in Japan. It was originally made for PS Vita. Despite being Vita and later PS4, it ran like garbage on the original Switch, like a fully unlocked frame rate, and then it's just perfect on Switch 2, and it's got the 1080p UI and everything, which is nice. I kept mentioning Mameda no Bakeru, which is an awesome Goemon style game, and I cannot hammer home enough how bad that was prior on the regular Switch 1. Like I was crushed when I first played it because it's like 20 to 60 FPS pretty much. It's very unstable, Unity based game. It was terrible. Now it's a lock 60. It currently runs better than I can get it to run on the Steam Deck using the PC version. There's levels on the Steam Deck where it just can't even hold 60 and it starts dipping into the 50s. And even that was kind of annoying. The Switch 2 just no problem powers through lock 60. It's great. And that's basically been true for everything I've tested. That said, there was a few disappointments. I saw some lists floating around and that kind of taught me, like, don't believe everything you read, where on the list it said both Sonic Frontiers and Spark the Electric Jester 3, which is a great game, by the way, were 60 FPS in Switch 2. Don't believe those lies. They are not 60. They are 30. And I actually wasted money in Spark 3. So, hey, I could play that again. I'll get it on Switch and play it at 60. It's not 60. So just be cautious when looking at tables and stuff out there. But if you have your existing library, feel free to just test whatever the heck you want because it's working great. And in fact, it seems like Nintendo's going to be dropping some updates soon to fix whatever problems do exist. Like, as we know, all the Carbon engine stuff that Limited Run put out, there was an issue with the Nintendo back-end API stuff that was causing glitches in all those games, basically unplayable. And I think that should be fixed soon. And hopefully other games as well will be sorted out. But even still, even as it is right now, I feel like most games work great. So it's not a wide issue all around. I did also notice, by the way, I need to check if they fixed it, but the Capcom Fighting Collection, Volume 1 and 2, were also quite broken. If you played the games for a while, the 2D games, the sprites would eventually just completely break and just start displaying random tiles and junk tiles everywhere. And that may be fixed now, but it was definitely broken as of last week.
Fair enough. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about GameChat. I mean, going back to the original Direct that introduced the system proper, GameChat was a properly showcase feature that they wanted to tell us about. And we got together to have a session of GameChat the other day, and I think ultimately we came away quite impressed with it. We'll talk about performance implications a bit later. But Oliver, this is pretty awesome, right?
Yeah, GameChat really surprised me. So it's basically like a Discord call-like interface where you can have a voice and potentially a video chat session with game streaming, with a face overlaid or a whole body overlaid over your video feed with up to 4 people, up to 3 other people essentially here. And it's integrated at the OS level. You even have a button for it on the controller, the C button right here that was so mysterious before Nintendo announced what its purpose was. And it's a really well integrated, really thoughtful system for having basically a voice comm system with your friends. So here, the thing that really impressed me most, and that was really evident in our testing that we did with John, was the quality of the audio On most other systems, to have a good quality audio feed, you need a good quality headset. You need to make sure it has low noise. You need to do all these different things for it. You need to make sure that people aren't like blasting audio over their televisions. That can be super annoying. I know on the PlayStation side of things, when people have the, when they're using the mic on their controller and you're hearing the clickety clacks, you're hearing the noise from the television. It's horrible. It's horrific. But here, we are getting such a good result. John was playing a game, right? Super loud game on a different system with lots of music, lots of audio blaring, and he was having to yell to even hear himself over that din.
Right.
And he was talking just to the microphone in the console from, I presume, several feet away, right?
Yeah.
And we're hearing his voice perfectly clearly, and that was so remarkable.
It was like 8 or 9 feet away, and the switch was directly located next to one of the speakers that I had absolutely cranked up. Actually, in between the left and center channel, sitting right there. And like you said, I had to yell to make myself heard. I had the volume up specifically for testing, and you couldn't hear it at all. But my voice was coming through clear. Like, what the heck?
No, not at all. The only thing we did hear was, because the system is tuned to distinguish human voices from the music, is when the game he was playing, when someone was speaking in that game, we could hear the person speaking in the game, but none of the music, nothing else. Also, John very amusingly pointed the camera towards the screen, and it masked out the player character in the game as if it was a human.
Yes,
that was also quite
the
amusing.
game I was playing, it masked out the character and sent him over.
Yeah, because basically what it does is it takes your video feed, it uses the machine learning hardware, the tensor cores in the unit itself, at least according to Nintendo and NVIDIA here, and it masks you out from your video feed, right? And it superimposes you potentially, if you choose to enable this feature, over a live stream of your screen, over a screen share essentially of your screen. So people can see what you're doing, they can see your face, you can also change it so it's just a cutout of your face in a circle. And interestingly, if you do that cutout, it will actually track your face in real time. Yep. So I could move my face around and it would always find me in the circle with a little bit of lag, and so it would get my face in there. So that was actually a really good feature. That was very, very cool. But I think that Nintendo was late to voice chat on consoles, like by some margin. Obviously, we've had voice chat on other consoles for like 20 years. In the past, on Switch 1, they had like a voice chat app you could use on your phone, but that was super inconvenient. But here I feel like they're late to the party, but they've executed with capabilities that are well and beyond any other console platform, that are, comparable to a good experience on a PC with a fast processor that can do a lot of this stuff in real time for you. I found the streaming functionality here to other players to be pretty neat. The AI background removal worked fantastically, like I said. The face tracking, again, worked amazingly well. The voice isolation was like almost better than anything else I've ever seen in a real-time application. It was super, super impressive. It's a really well thought out package that's beautifully executed, wrapped up in a pretty good interface. The only possible caveat here from my perspective, I mean, there are a couple caveats, but the biggest caveat from my perspective is that you do need to have friend codes, right? It's a friend code based system. It is still a little bit annoying interfacing with other players. There are some limitations in the streaming system. So for instance, I can't stream my face feed if I have a full screen view of the game open. I need to have a view of the game open with at least some of the people beneath it. Basically, you need to have that split view open, presumably for like safety reasons. You wouldn't want people to forget they're streaming to other players. That seems like a sensible compromise. And there are a couple other things with like video quality and things like that we can discuss. But in general, it was super impressive system. I've also used it with my friends separate from this recording engagement a few days ago, and it's just been really impressive the entire time. I've never heard anyone's game audio or anything like that. It's just a super impressive system.
So yeah, same for me. I use it with some other friends as well. And I use it on my second setup over here with that second dock. I actually shoved the Switch 2 behind my PC, which was processing a video, by the way. So the fans are going, it was noisy, and it was hidden back behind a ledge, and it still worked perfectly somehow, which is just... I'm really impressed. It made me wonder if they're leveraging any of the work that NVIDIA did for like its like broadcast suite of AI tools, for isolating voice and noise canceling. So they already have the hardware there. It would make sense to actually do something with that because it's super effective, as you say.
Mm-hmm. Actually seems to be better than the RTX broadcast stuff.
Agreed, yeah.
Oddly enough. I've got some notes here. Let's talk about the performance of GameChat, right? Because let's just take a look at my captured session. I was basically running Cyberpunk benchmarks while everybody was engaged with game chat. You can see that the game frame rate is the game frame rate, but you can also see down at the bottom that the feeds are basically 10 frames per second that you get in, including your own. That was quite interesting. Also interesting is that those feeds independently update, that arbitrarily independently updating per screen. And on top of that, the overlays of the people are also operating independently of the gameplay feed as well, which is quite interesting, just sort of from a sort of academic perspective in terms of the nuts and bolts of it.
Very Sega Saturn, if you will.
Yes, VDP 1 and 2. Yeah, absolutely. Here's the thing, right? Going into this, obviously we had access to some developer documentation which was saying that GameChat does have a system overhead, and I don't think that's particularly surprising now based on the quality of it and what it's doing. It's probably a hit worth taking, but there is a hit there which may or may not manifest, I think it's fair to say, depending on how much of the system resources the game is using. So while we did this test, I basically ran those canned Cyberpunk benchmarks where already there are performance drops without game chat. And it was quite interesting to see what happened. So the Kabuki streaming benchmark that we used here, I actually tested this at 40 FPS performance modes to get as much stress on the system as possible. At the beginning, I actually found that the game chat performance was higher, which is unexpected, but it comes at the cost of streaming issues where assets are actually streaming in much later than they were without game chat active. So yeah, that's kind of interesting. It took around 15, 20 seconds or so for the streaming issue on the game chat side to resolve itself. Could it have been a one-off? Well, I actually tested that twice and had the same issue. So I do think it is game chat, obviously, having an issue there. It's not going to affect gameplay. And if you actually look there, Cyberpunk was actually being played by Tom, and everything kind of seemed okay there. Otherwise, the benchmark proceeded pretty much like for like, run-to-run variances, but within expectations, until the end, where we got into a really dense area of the Kabuki area of the map, and then we started to see some performance drops there on the game chat side. I also had another benchmark from within Cyberpunk, which we can run. It's kind of like a mission race scene, mostly like for like, not too many issues there. There was a section further on in the benchmark where you could actually see that the non-game chat run is significantly faster. I also tried what I consider to be a completely GPU limited run scene from the Phantom Liberty black market. Both versions ran essentially identically. So it seems to be the case that if a system is under load, possibly on the CPU side, oddly enough, then you may encounter some performance drops using game chat. But ultimately, the feature set that it's provided, I think it's probably worth it. It's pretty impressive stuff overall. Okay, so another system feature that we really wanted to test out. And John, GameShare. This is an interesting concept, right? Switch 2 gaming on Switch 1 consoles. Tell us more.
Yeah, so this kind of is an idea that goes a little bit back to some of the DS days, I guess, where Nintendo allowed you to sort of do a download play thing where if you had one copy of a game, you could have your friend nearby with another DS and then download sort of like a copy of it to that system, and you could play multiplayer. Games today are too big for that, obviously, so that's not going to work. So what they've instead done is implemented GameShare, which, of course, is a video streaming solution. They even cited the Wii U experience as sort of like, I guess, a test or like the inspiration for this, perhaps, and maybe even technologically it's related. But in terms of the actual results, I would say it is nowhere near the quality of what the Wii U delivered. Essentially, so in my experience, image quality just takes a gigantic hit. Things do not look good with GameShare, in my experience. Now, the problem is that the one GameShare game I've tested is Fast Fusion, which is a very, very fast game, as the name implies. And that already has some image quality issues. So I feel like it's maybe a worst case scenario for it in terms of image quality, but you're really left with something that just looks like you're watching a YouTube video that has only processed a 360p, and it's just full of artifacts and noise, and it looks bad. But on the flip side, it was largely smooth, which I guess is key. Not perfect, but in general, it actually kind of held a smooth 60 frames per second update. So it actually moved better than I expected. So they seem to have sacrificed image quality for fluidity, which is maybe not the worst choice. But in addition, there is also the input lag. And based on the variability of the connection, it can also cause the input lag to spike and get worse. And there's also occasional momentary freezes, various things like that. So in a pinch, it works. But so far, in this case, I would say it's not really a fun or optimal way to play anything for the second player. Like, it feels decidedly unfair, where the main player doing the sharing gets the native experience, and then the other person gets that, basically, which is not great. But yeah, so I just want to see it used in other games and see if it's actually more usable for slower games, and if that has any impact on overall image quality. I assume it actually might. But I'm a little disappointed, considering how well Nintendo did this video streaming stuff with the Wii U, that they wouldn't. I feel like if they had taken this a little more seriously, they could have implemented something that was perhaps a bit more potent, and that's not what we got.
Okay, I expected more from the video encoder, to be honest. I did some Cyberpunk clips last night for a project I'm working on, and it's like 10 megabit, 1080p, 30 AVC. And it's kind of like strobing artifacts in it. It's really not good. The sort of in-console video captures and rarely, that impressive. But, they've got an NVIDIA encoder in this one, which does fantastic things on PC, and surely it can do better. Surely it can do better. I don't know. Okay, something else we really wanted to talk about is a couple of issues that we've encountered with virtual game cards and just the user interface in general, which it's troublesome, it's annoying, and shouldn't really be like this, but hopefully it can be fixed. Oliver, I've read your notes here. They're exhaustive. Let's go through them.
I'll try to explain this as best I can. I'll have some examples on screen. It's a little bit convoluted, but I'll try to get through it. So basically, they have this new system called virtual game cards, right? Which is conceptually how you manage, how you download games onto the Switch 2 system, onto the Switch 1 system as well, as of the May 2025 update. So it adds a ton of complexity. So basically, before, you had games on your system and games you didn't, right? Now you have games on your system and games you don't have in your system, and games you have loaded as a virtual game card, and games you don't have loaded as a virtual game card. So you have to manage these two separate states, these binary states, at the same time on your system, which adds a lot of complexity. So when you go into the system interface, when you click that Show More button, which I think used to be called Show All button on the right-hand side of that main interface, the default view is all the games you've ever downloaded to your system. You have to go into a sub-menu to see games you've just got downloaded right now. That means you're seeing a mix of downloaded games and not downloaded games by default, which feels really counterintuitive. I have 450 games, so this is a super annoying thing to have to scroll through this list, which has games that I've not gone on my system, games that I've gone on my system. Basically, I have all my games in that menu by default. It's quite annoying. And even if I did want to download or delete every single icon that I don't have on my system and delete them from virtual game cards, then that means that I can't add the games to my groups menu, which is really important, because when you have as many games as I do, and when Nintendo makes interface navigation as clunky as this, you really need to have a lot of groups. So in theory, I can add them via virtual game cards first, then cancel the download, then I can add them to my groups. But then if I delete them from virtual game cards, it also deletes them from my groups, so I'm ruining it the whole time through, right? It's really, really annoying. And there's also no way to stop the virtual game cards downloads at once. So if you, like, let's say you have a new system or you're trying to load a virtual game cards into your system, you have to load them 30 game cards at a time. But you can't stop all the downloads at once. You have to either go through it manually or wait until your storage fills up, and then you can click a button and stop all downloads, right? So that's really, really annoying. Virtual game cards, ultimately, it's a functionality I didn't ask for, I didn't need. I have virtually zero need to have two systems that can be connected, that don't have to be connected to the internet at any given time, that can share games between them. That is a problem that I do not have. In practice, the solution to me is unloading games that you aren't playing, but then you're destroying your group settings, and groups are the only way that I can keep this at all manageable. So that's really annoying. There are definitely things they could improve about it, but I think the concept of making people manage a digital licensing system separately from the ability to download games is just really complex and introduces a lot of hassle. It's just a drag on the experience. If I'm struggling with it conceptually, and if I'm struggling with it as a matter of implementation, imagine how like a kid or a stressed parent would manage. I think this thing is just really way more complex than it needs to be for its own good. And ultimately, like the thing you get with it is you can enable digital licensing in the system settings to be able to connect to the internet with your console and be able to play the games on your console without having the virtual game card loaded. The problem is they don't let you go back to the old interface. So no matter what, I'm still dealing with this clunky virtual game card interface. I cannot go back to the old system, which, while it had its foibles, it was fine. And this digital licensing system that Nintendo had before was very similar to the digital licensing systems that are used by Sony and Microsoft. It is a sensible digital licensing system with a primary console with secondary consoles. That is the better way to go. And I'm really disappointed they removed that functionality. It's really annoying. If you only have like 20 games or something, or if you have a primarily physical library like John does, I don't think it's a huge issue. But for me, it's a gigantic problem with my 450 digital games. It's super, super annoying. And then in addition, there are a couple issues that aren't related to VGC. Like there's no filters anywhere in the system for Switch 1 games and Switch 2 games. In the Show More menu or in the VGC menu, and the cross-platform games, they oftentimes show no indication whether they're Switch 1 or Switch 2. They never show any kind of graphical indication on the box art, on the image, whether they're Switch 1 or Switch 2. Sometimes they have a Switch 2 edition next to them or something. That's the case with many titles. But like for Hogwarts Legacy, for instance, which is a title I have on Switch 1 and Switch 2, there's no indication that one is Switch 1 or Switch 2, unless you've memorized the artwork, which is slightly different between the two. There's no Switch 2 edition, there's no Switch 2 icon. It's the exact same game, basically, with very similar artwork, very hard to tell them apart. And this is a huge pain, and I think it'll become even more problematic over time. As we move more into the Switch 2 era, we have more Switch 2 software. It's going to be harder to keep track of it. You can do manual work with groups if you want to keep track of this, again, within the foibles of the VGC card interface. But I wish Nintendo would just add a filter for it, like Sony does. And in general, if they just added more filters to their interface to make it more manageable, like is the case in the PS5 interface, like is the case in the Xbox interface, where you have some degree of sortability through those different platforms that games arrive on. So just a few problems. I hope that the visuals on screen make it kind of make sense here. But they've just basically added a number of really irritating frictions to the experience, especially for people who have like unreasonably large Switch 1 libraries. And I know several other people who are in the same boat as me and who are having issues with this. So I just wanted to flag that Nintendo really needs to fix this problem, in my opinion, because it is slightly infuriating that they downgraded the experience so much from Switch 1, again, for players who do have large libraries to manage.
Yeah, in actual fact, I'm struggling to think of any advantages of the virtual game card versus how things were. What do you think, John?
I do think there's one advantage, and it's a small one and not something applicable yet. But so with the original Switch, the idea here is that sometimes, let's say you had multiple Switch units, right? Like a Switch Lite. I would have, like, say my Switch OLED as the primary system, and then say I was traveling, getting on a plane somewhere, and I wanted to bring the Switch Lite. The problem is any digital games on the non-primary system would need to connect to the server to use them. So the the virtual game card lets you essentially lend it out to the system you're going to take with you on the go, which is cool. But that's the only benefit. And on Switch 2 software, it doesn't matter yet because there is no Switch 2 revision. There will be, but not yet. And like you said, Oliver, I mean, my library is mostly physical anyway, so it hasn't been a huge problem. But that doesn't mean I haven't also experienced some frustration, specifically with so I did not do the system transfer thing. I didn't actually have enough SD card space to do it initially because I didn't get the SD card right away. I do have it now. So I was kind of doing things manually. The problem is like on my Switch OLED, a lot of games are just like considered virtual game carded, I guess, already, right? And if I want to install it on the Switch 2, it needs to remove it from the Switch OLED and allow it to load on the Switch 2. Problem is, even like half the time, even if I have the Switch OLED right there, it's turned on, it's connected to the internet, the Switch 2 will just say, "Oh, the Switch, it's not online. You need to be online. Get it online." and it doesn't work. It just fails over and over again. The workaround is to go onto the Switch OLED and remove the virtual game card from the Switch OLED side, and then it pops up on the Switch 2. But even then, it still pops up, even though it works, it still pops up an error message saying, oh, we couldn't do this. The operation failed because the system was offline. And I have no idea why, and it's driving me nuts. So, like, the whole thing of, like, if I just want to install a game that I had in my digital library, I got to jump through these hoops every freaking time now. And I can't figure out why it's acting this way, but it does not work reliably at all, and it's made the whole virtual game card system kind of unusable right now for me.
I think there are things that Nintendo can definitely do to improve this system. I'm sure if you addressed me and John's complaints, those are addressable complaints. But I also think just separately, it is a conceptually challenging concept of a system to have to manage these two categories of games. And some games you downloaded aren't loaded on your system and you can play them offline. Some are loaded that you can play them online but aren't downloaded to your system. Vice versa. It gets very, very complex here. So I think this is a kind of interface that even someone like Sony or Microsoft might struggle to implement. I don't think with Nintendo's history with these kinds of console interfaces, they're probably the best suited to deliver this kind of experience. And I don't think ultimately the experience is satisfactory for the end user. I don't see a ton of people clamoring for this feature. I don't see a ton of people for whom this feature is like a game changer. Maybe it is a game changer for some individuals, but like if it is a big deal, for instance, for a family to have this feature, the difficulties of managing it are intense, right? Even for one user potentially. For multiple users, multiple systems, understanding this, conceptualizing this, making this work, I think it's going to prove too hard for a lot of people. So I'd encourage them to at least give me a toggle to go back, all the way back. if they can, that'd be nice. But yeah, it's a pain at the moment.
Okay, let's summarize then. Let's see what we actually think of the Switch 2 in review. I'm going to go to you first, Oliver, for your thoughts here. I mean, has this landed where you expected? Anything untoward? What do you particularly like, dislike?
Yeah, just on the kind of hardware side and kind of overall impression side, I'm pretty happy with it. Overall, the hardware is performant, early games run well. The surprising thing for me, really, to go back to it, was the fact that so many games do a pretty good job of targeting that 1080p display, whether it's using DLSS to get there, as is the case in like some games like Pokemon, like Hogwarts, whether it's using high native resolutions and like otherwise, less ambitious titles like Mario Kart World, like a lot of the Switch 1 enhanced games. I think it's a pretty good story there. And I think actually going to 1080p makes a fair bit of sense, especially when you consider the fact that it gives you a really nice venue to upgrade some of those Switch 1 titles with enhancements on Switch 2. And it actually does look quite good on Switch 2. That's something I wasn't really expecting. I think the DLSS story is also pretty good here. The fact that DLSS is available and that at least a version of it is relatively cheap bodes well for the system. On day one, we're getting a title that uses DLSS to 4K, right, in Fast Fusion. That's something that's pretty impressive. And it has pretty intense content, so it does not work too well, but it's impressive. As the downside, of course, games are targeting low internal resolutions. There are issues with that. But yeah, overall, it's pretty impressive that there's like apparently at least like a probably a lower quality version from at least our visual impression of it, a lower quality version of DLSS that actually does work well in the system, that can actually enable it to achieve these like sky high output targets that Nintendo has that you'd normally not expect a system of this caliber to deal with. And it actually delivers a pretty convincing image and stills. Mm-hmm. So in terms of negatives on the hardware side in particular, obviously the screen is not that impressive. I'm really hoping for a SWOLED 2, a Switch 2 OLED unit at some point in the near future, maybe the next couple of years. Because this display is really not what I wanted it to be, especially when Nintendo came out and said, this is a HDR panel. You do not expect a panel that goes to like 360, 400 nits to be advertised as an HDR panel without any kind of local dimming. That's a big disappointment. The blurring issue, the persistence issue, again, it annoys me. I'm normally not sensitive to these kinds of things, and it annoys me and it makes me a little bit peeved, unfortunately. So that's not very good. The other big disappointment is just the UI quality, which I feel is degraded relative to Switch 1 as of like a few months ago. It's just not where I'd want it to be. The VGC system is obviously a big part of that, but also just the difficulty of managing Switch 1 titles and now Switch 2 titles, keeping them separated. Again, that should be a better system. But overall, I feel like this is a good platform for Nintendo games for the next 6, 7, 8 years. I think games look pretty good on it. I think games run well. I've been generally impressed with the overall performance of titles on the system. I've been impressed with the efficiency of the system. I'm impressed with the physical outlay of the system. I think it's forward looking in some good ways by Nintendo standards with the adoption of technologies like HDR, like VRR. And it's pretty astounding in terms of performance and efficiency relative to other devices that have a similar form factor. I think it's very impressive, and I think it will remain impressive for probably quite a while. So yeah, I'm impressed with it overall. Maybe we could have some comments on the software quality and things like that. But I think this is going to be a good system to carry Nintendo through for the next generation of console software.
Mm-hmm. John?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with you on a lot of that, Oliver. And fundamentally, this is a vehicle for the next 8 years of Nintendo software, and I think as such, it's a pretty good piece of hardware. But they've kept up the tradition of Nintendo, which is releasing a portable system with a screen that instantly makes you want an upgraded version of the system. It was like that for the Game Boy, the Game Boy Advance, the DS, the 3DS, the original Switch, and now the Switch 2. The only one where that's not the case is the Virtual Boy, which has an amazing screen with like CRT-like motion clarity that absolutely destroys the Switch 2. But the screen is really only my really only big issue with it, and that is kind of a big issue if you want to use the system portably, because honestly, with the size of it and the lack of motion clarity, I actually find it hard on the eyes. Like my brain wants to lock on to images as I do on other displays, but it can't because it just blurs, and I find that gives me kind of like eye strain in a way that I don't like. So it's not that pleasant to use. So that is a huge bummer. But as far as like the docked experience is going, I mean, the hardware seems great. It's powerful enough for it. It's very efficient, and I'm very eager to see what Nintendo games look like going forward, because it's nice to finally be at a point where image quality is not a huge problem on a Nintendo system. That's great.
Right.
The resolutions are much higher. They've got HDR in there. You know, things are just looking good on that front, and Nintendo loves 60 FPS. They did it a lot on Switch 1. I think we'll see even more of it this time. Maybe we'll even see some 120 frames per second Nintendo games, which I never thought we'd get to. But yeah. Plus the backwards compatibility is amazing. The updated software that actually received proper Switch 2 updates is also really nice. It's basically like Nintendo looking at Dolphin and one-upping them. In a lot of ways, which is cool to have that officially done. So yeah. Oh, we didn't mention the speakers, by the way, the sound capabilities. And I will say, one, I've had better luck pairing Bluetooth headphones to the Switch 2 versus Switch 1. Switch 1 was very inconsistent. Some of my headphones did not work wirelessly with it. Some did. It works better on the Switch 2 thus far. The actual built-in speakers, I think, sound a lot better overall, but they're still not as loud as I would like. And once you've experienced like as Apple hardware with their speakers, you realize like how far off most mobile devices are. Like a MacBook Pro or like the recent iPads or even the recent iPhones, like the sound quality is just another level, and they get really loud. Switch 2 is much less loud, and it sounds good, but it's not as much as I'd like. So it's good, but not great. I do love the Joy-Con, the magnetic system. I think that's cool, and it does have that little bit of wobble I mentioned, but it's still better than the rail system, and it feels very satisfying to use. And yeah, I mean, I think it's not perfect, but it's quite a nice improvement over the original Switch, and it should serve well as that Nintendo vehicle.
Yeah. My thoughts on it, I mean, I won't go into the screen side of things as you two have gone into
A lot.
Very good depth on that. Yeah, ultimately, I think the hardware is great. I think they've done a really good job with it. I think the pricing possibly slightly high, but I don't think anybody's going to feel shortchanged by it, particularly if you got the Mario Kart bundle. I think that was a fairly good deal, I think. And going on to Mario Kart, I mean, that is going to be for a lot of people the first point of contact with this new system, and I think they've knocked it out of the park with a fantastic piece of software. And that's kind of what you want going into a new console generation, right? Because, you know, the 60 frames per second, the open world, all of those characters, it just looks great. It feels like something you couldn't really have done on the original system. It's kind of like making a statement, and not really in terms of like, technological supremacy as such. Because I think it's more about the fact you're just having a great time, and it looks great and it feels great, and that's kind of what Nintendo is all about, and they've delivered. So I'm really looking forward to their next big release, which will be Donkey Kong Bonanza, I believe, on the first party front.
Oh yeah.
The other thing, of course, is you're quite right. All of those Switch 1 games that have received Switch 2 enhancements, which we're going to find time to cover at some point, but it also goes to show how timeless those original games are on the Switch 1. And you can just increase the resolution and frame rate and not do much more to them. And those games are still like as good as they were the day they came out. I think that's fair to say. It's just something about what Nintendo does that is just extraordinary. Hardware side, beyond the screen, literally the only thing that annoys me is the length of the USB cables, and for that to be the point of annoyance, I think is points to a job well done pretty much everywhere else. So yeah, hats off to Nintendo. The efficiency side of things is just extraordinary. Bodes well, I think, potentially for whatever Nvidia is doing for itself in the laptop and handheld space, right? Because if they could achieve this on like a really old process node with an out of date architecture, the concept of them bringing their newer architectures on a more modern process node is potentially mouthwatering, right? And the fact that you're getting this efficiency of Switch 2, which if the tests work out the way I think they do, it's just going to knock the Steam Deck completely out of the park on that front. I think it's an astonishing achievement. And that's what I think of the Switch 2. Oh, and of course, that Pro Controller really is something special. I was not expecting that. And I think, going into this, looking for surprises, it's quite interesting that, a peripheral made such an impact, but it really is really, really good. But yeah, we've got a lot more Switch 2 stuff to come. But before we go, any final comments from you guys?
I think that the software side of things is kind of interesting. Obviously, Mario Kart World is like the key title there, like you said, Rich. It's a really great game, really enjoyable. I enjoyed covering it. I've enjoyed playing it. I think I've logged like 45 hours or something godly that old so far. I'm really having a lot of fun with it. Fast Fusion is also great. It's a little bit slower than Fast RMX, which I quite liked. It's a fun game. It's really enjoyable in the same way that those old fast racing games were. Really getting my kicks out of that. There are some great ports. Hogwarts Legacy, I think we're going to probably cover that at some point. It's a great port. It's quite a good port. Cyberpunk is quite a good port. The patched Switch 1 games are great. The Switch editions are great. Switch 2 editions are great. The biggest upgrade of those would probably be Pokemon, which will have some content out I think, before this video, which is totally transformed in image quality and performance. It's a huge boost. Overall, I have a pretty solid impression of the software quality on Switch 2. I think the launch lineup has a good number of solid games in it. Not that many new games, only really 2 big new games by my count, but it has a pretty solid lineup, I think, compared to the 3DS, which didn't really launch with any big games, compared with the Wii U, which, again, didn't really launch with any really big games. On Switch 1, famously, it had Breath of the Wild at launch, which is kind of a hard title to compete with. That was not an exclusive. It was also on Wii U, but, of course, very few people owned a Wii U, relatively speaking. But Switch 2 has Mario Kart World, which I think is kind of on that same caliber as being a big exclusive. I'm not going to say that it's as good or not as good or whatever. People can come to their own conclusions in that one, but it certainly is a big title there on day one, and it has greater third-party support from big publishers. I think we're seeing that on with Switch 2 early on. We're seeing titles like Elden Ring, Cyberpunk, Final Fantasy VII Remake, titles like this that are coming in the first year of the system's life cycle, and I think that's really impressive to be there. And Switch 1 was not really on that same level with third-party support in its early days. So I think that's quite important and quite interesting. And I think a lot will depend on like the extent to which we see something like a Nintendo Direct in the next few months, perhaps, outlining some more of their third-party support in particular. Because I feel like from the first 2 summer showcases, from the 3 summer showcases that we saw earlier this month, that there probably is some untapped powder on the Switch 2 front, because almost every single game that got announced did not list a Switch version or a Switch 2 version. I kind of feel like they're keeping their powder dry for that, for a Switch 2 dedicated event. I think they will probably have an event at some point to outline more of their plans, but I think so far the software lineup is pretty good. I don't know what you think, John, but I'm pretty happy with it overall.
Yeah, I mean, I echo a lot of what you said. I do think, though, the one thing they have to be cautious with is just the more I hear from developers and publishers and such, Nintendo is being very cagey about announcing new software. They're preventing people from encouraging developers not to announce Switch 2 games too quickly. Perhaps don't port this game to Switch 2, making it a little bit slower to get development hardware than some companies might like. It feels like the rollout is very frustratingly slow in a way. That could impact the coming year in terms of a number of games, because in addition to that, Nintendo doesn't have the Wii U lineup to lean on in terms of porting games over. We already kind of know what the rest of this year looks like from Nintendo for the most part, right? And some of that stuff's also still multi-platform, like Metroid Prime 4. So I'm just a little bit worried that they're being too cautious right now, and it might result in more of a software drought than we expect going forward. So I don't yet know what that's going to be. But that's one concern I have going forward, aside from the hardware itself. The final thing about the hardware, though, before we hop off here, I didn't mention the little rubber pads. I like those things. Do you notice those?
Oh, yeah.
On the bottom when you sit on your desk or set it down, it's at these little tiny rubber feet that just makes it so that when you set the Switch down that way, it doesn't feel like it's clunking directly on the surface. It's a very tiny little thing, but it's an appreciated difference. And also, the kickstand is surprisingly strong and nicely made. So I'm actually happy with that aspect of the system as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from my perspective, the thing I'm looking forward to, and I've sort of alluded to it before, it's Star Wars Outlaws, right? I mean, we can talk about Cyberpunk as a benchmark game, and it is, but it is ultimately a scalable game. And there are certain game engines that were devised with the current generation consoles in mind and were kind of, made to work on an Xbox Series S, if you like.
Yeah.
So the concept of being able to run those games on a machine like the Switch 2, which is at a different hardware performance bracket altogether, really looking forward to seeing how that works out. But again, and I've said this many, many times, don't discount the ingenuity of developers. It might take some time to get there, but we saw some tremendous things on Switch 1.
Yep.
And I'm fully expecting to see the same thing on Switch 2. But that's it. That's the end of this review. Like, subscribe, share on the off chance you enjoyed it. Ring bells for notifications for you. Potential algorithmic boosts for us, but please do consider supporting us via the DF supporter program. Behind the scenes access, early access, news updates from the team, Discord access, brilliant community. There's a lot going on there. But that's all from us on this marathon review. Thanks as ever for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.